There are infinite ways to leave this world, but some are more brutal than others. She disappeared off the face of the earth. Zela Lowry, a 24-year-old free spirit, the one her family said could make anyone laugh, was gone. 7 months later, bones are found by the water. The mystery of where she was becomes the mystery of who did this. The medical examiner finds the story written in her fractured skull, massive blunt trauma. This was not random, this was rage. The investigation becomes a spiderweb, pulling in one viable suspect after another. From an elusive ex-husband to a volatile family member with a dark secret of his own. For 11 long years, the case freezes solid, until a new technology and a desperate jailhouse tip point to a forgotten, dilapidated trailer. There, a chemical spray reveals a silent witness. Blood, just lying there, waiting 14 years for someone to come and tell its story. If you find these kinds of forensic puzzles compelling and want to see how this incredible case was solved, please be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more true crime stories. The cold was not just a temperature, it was a presence. In McDowell County, it crept in from the water, a silent hunter that found the gaps in clothing and the thin spots in a person's resolve. The air was thin and sharp, holding the promise of more ice, and the ground was hard, unforgiving to the two men who walked its surface. They moved with their heads down, their breath pluming in front of them, two small islands of warmth in an ocean of quiet, frigid air. "It's a bitter one," the younger man said, his voice muffled by the scarf pulled up to his nose. The older man just grunted. He felt the cold deeper. He felt it in his joints, a sharp ache that reminded him of his age. They walked this path often, down near the edge of Lake James, but today the silence felt different. It was heavier, as if the air itself was holding its breath, waiting. He stopped first. The younger man almost collided with him. "What is it?" The older man didn't answer immediately. He was listening, or perhaps sensing. There was no sound, but the brittle snap of a frozen twig, somewhere far off, and the faint, almost imperceptible sigh of water moving against a frozen shore. But something was wrong. A break in the rhythm of the world he knew. "Over there," the older man finally said, nodding toward a place where the bank dipped low. The younger man saw nothing, just the same hard-packed, frosted earth. "What?" "I don't see, not see. Smell." The younger man inhaled, pulling the cold air deep. Underneath the clean, sharp scent of ice and damp earth, there was something else. A faint, sweet, and sickly smell. The smell of something that had given up. They moved toward it, their boots crackling on the frozen ground. The sound was too loud in the stillness, and then they saw it. It was a bundle, a large, sodden mass wrapped in what looked like a bedsheet. It was stained dark with mud and damp, and it was nestled partially against a tangle of roots, as if someone had tried to hide it and failed. They stood several feet away. Neither man moved to touch it. "It's just trash someone dumped," the younger one said, but his voice lacked conviction. "No," the older man said. He had seen too much in his life. Trash didn't smell like that. Trash didn't have that particular heavy stillness. That ain't trash. A corner of the sheet was loose, fluttering slightly in a breeze they couldn't feel. The younger man found a long, sturdy stick, and, his hand shaking, he reached forward. He nudged the heavy fabric. It was stiff, frozen in places. He pushed it back, just an inch, then another. He recoiled, dropping the stick as if it had burned him. "Oh, no," he whispered, stumbling back. "No." The older man stepped forward, his face grim. He didn't need a stick. He leaned closer, his eyes narrowing. He saw only a small part of what was inside, a pale, curved shape, something that was unmistakably, horribly human. "Get the sheriff," the older man said, his voice flat. He did not look away. He felt a sudden, profound duty to stand watch, to not let this thing be alone again. The younger man fumbled for his phone, his fingers numb and clumsy. "There's no signal. Damn it." "Walk up the rise," the older man commanded, his gaze fixed on the bundle. "Go. Run." The younger man ran, slipping and sliding on the frozen earth, his lungs burning. The older man waited, The silence returned, heavier now. The smell seemed to be everywhere, clinging to the inside of his coat, the back of his throat. He felt the cold then, not as an ache, but as a violation. It felt like an eternity before he heard the sound of an engine and then the crunch of official boots. Sheriff Brody arrived, his face already set in the mask of tired professionalism that small-town lawmen wore. He was a man who knew every family in the county, which made days like this so much harder. He glanced at the older man. A curt nod of acknowledgement. "You didn't touch it?" "Just the stick. My partner." He poked it. Brody knelt, pulling on gloves. He didn't need to do much. He gently lifted the frozen corner of the sheet, looked for less than a second, and let it fall. He stood up, exhaling a long, slow cloud of white. "Get this area taped off," he said to his deputy, who was already pulling the yellow roll from his trunk. "Call the State Bureau and get Dr. Butts. Tell him we've got one. It's bad." The older man watched them work, the efficient, sterile movements of men who were trying to keep the horror at arm's length. The news would travel faster than their cars. It would move through the phone lines, from the dispatcher to a cousin, from a deputy to his wife. It would be a whisper in the diner by noon, a shadow falling over every conversation in town. They all knew someone was missing. They had known for 7 long months. A young woman, barely 24, a free spirit who, they had hoped, had just run off for a new life. They had prayed she was in another state, laughing in some new bar, forgetting them. Sheriff Brody walked back to his car, his radio crackling. He sat in the driver's seat for a full minute before starting the engine, the heater blasting. He knew what every person in McDowell County would be asking by nightfall. He knew the name that was already forming on their lips, a cold dread that matched the morning. Zila? Had they found Zila Lowry? The name, once whispered, was now a file. Zila Lowry. The discovery at the lake's edge had forced the quiet, hopeful conversations to stop. The 7-month-long period of willful belief, of telling stories about where she might have gone, had ended with the sheriff's knock on her family's door. Zila was 24. Or at least, she was 24 when she was last seen. She was a woman who seemed to collect light. People were simply drawn to her. At the truck stop, where she worked long shifts as a waitress, she was the one they all waited for. She navigated the tired, lonely men and the hurried families with an energy that felt rare. She knew how to turn a complaint into a laugh, a bad day into a shared joke. Her family called her their jokester, the one who would start the fun, the one who believed that any situation, no matter how grim, could be brightened. She liked to party. She liked the feeling of a good song and a full room. She was, as her sister would later tell detectives, a free spirit, and free spirits, by their nature, were unpredictable. This was the story her family had told themselves for 7 months. The last time anyone saw her, she had just finished a grueling double shift. She was tired, her feet ached, but she was in good spirits, waiting for a ride. And then, she was gone. In the first few days, there was annoyance. Zila had done this before, gone off for a day or two with friends, following an impulse. But then, a week passed. Her paycheck from the truck stop sat untouched. Calls to her closest friends revealed nothing. They were as lost as her family. The annoyance curdled into a low, thrumming anxiety. "Any time you have a missing persons case," the sheriff had explained, "you have to look at it from 2 directions. Had she met with foul play, or was she missing because she wanted to be?" With Zila, the second option had always seemed so heartbreakingly possible. She had talked about leaving, about seeing the world beyond the Appalachian foothills. The family clung to this. They had to. The alternative was unthinkable. They created a new life for her in their minds. She was waitressing in a diner by the ocean. She was in a big city. She was laughing with new friends. This was the only way to endure the not knowing. Now, that fragile hope was being systematically dismantled. The discovery by the lake forced the second, darker possibility into the room. It was a cold, demanding presence. The family was brought in, asked the hard questions. They were asked about her life, her habits, her relationships. And her relationships, like Zila herself, were complicated. The sheriff's department spent hours looking for the young woman, but now they were forced to change the investigation. This was no longer about finding Zila. This was about finding out what had happened to her. The first step was to give the remains a name. Without a name, there was no victim. Without a victim, there could be no justice. The bones, still wrapped in the sodden sheet, were carefully documented, collected, and transported. They were sent out of the county to the one man who could make them speak. Dr. John Butts was the chief medical examiner. He was a man who lived in a world of quiet, methodical precision. He was not a man who guessed. He was a problem solver, presented with the most final of riddles. His job was to take the broken pieces, the silent clues, and assemble them into a conclusion, into a story that could be told. The authorities notified him that the remains had been found and that they suspected they belonged to Zila Lowry. The puzzle was now on his table, and in the cold, sterile quiet of his morgue, he began his work. The family, the friends, the entire county held their breath and waited for him to tell them the truth. Dr. John Butts was a man who preferred puzzles to people. People were unpredictable, their motives clouded by emotion. A puzzle was honest. It presented its pieces, and it was his job to make them fit. The remains from Lake James were the most complex puzzle he had faced in some time. He began the slow, methodical work of laying them out in anatomical configuration. The first fact was plain. They had been exposed to the environment for a considerable length of time. There was very little attached flesh. This immediately removed the most common methods of identification from his toolkit. Without skin, standard methods like fingerprinting were impossible. But the bones themselves had a story to tell. He looked first at the hip bones, the heads of the femurs, and the size of the mastoid bones behind the ears. The information was clear. The remains belonged to a woman. Next, he examined the signs of wear on the bones. He looked at the vertebrae to see if they had begun to get spurs on them. He studied the growth plates. He could see that all of the growth plates had matured. This told him the individual was probably up into their 20s, a woman in her 20s. The findings were consistent with Zila Lowry, but consistent was not a word Dr. Butts liked. It was imprecise. He needed certainty. The sheriff needed certainty. A family, waiting in a state of suspended grief, deserved certainty. The next logical step was a dental examination. This was the way the majority of decomposed, skeletonized remains were identified. But a dental exam only works if you have enough restorations, fillings, and changes in your dentition to separate you from other individuals. Dr. Butts received Zila Lowry's dental records from her family dentist. He began the comparison. He looked at the teeth from the lake, and he looked at the charts. He checked them again, and a third time. He had found a match, but it was a useless one. The records showed that Zila Lowry had perfect teeth. She had no fillings. She had no restorations. The remains before him also had perfect teeth. There were no unique features. Nothing specific to match. He could not, based on this, definitively say this was her. It was a frustrating dead end. For the investigation, this was a critical failure. Without a positive identification, the case would stall before it even began. Dr. Butts, however, was not finished. He had to find another way. He turned his attention back to the skull. It was fragmented, but mostly there. He took a series of detailed X-rays. He was not looking at the teeth this time. He was looking at the frontal sinuses, the small, hollow spaces in the frontal bone above the eyes. He knew what few outside his field did, that like a fingerprint, the pattern of these sinuses is unique to every single individual. The investigative file for Zila's disappearance was thick. Detectives had, months ago, collected every piece of her life they could find. Among those papers were some excellent X-rays, taken during her life for a medical reason unrelated to her disappearance. Dr. Butts placed the two sets of X-rays side by side, the image from her life and the image from his table. He leaned in. He did not need to search for long. The pattern was undeniable. He could see multiple areas where she had unique features, the precise curve of one chamber, the exact placement of a partition. It was a perfect, definitive, and indisputable match. He made the call. "It's her," he said, his voice void of emotion, a simple statement of fact. The remains found at Lake James was Zila Lowry. The news traveled quickly, a wave of cold certainty that settled over the county. The period of not knowing, which one family member had described as a kind of madness, was over. The vague, desperate hope that she had just taken off to live in some other part of the country was extinguished. They knew Zila was dead. The confirmation was never a pleasant thing to deliver. But as Dr. Butts knew, even the worst news can sometimes be easier to deal with than no news at all. For the family, a terrible chapter had closed. For the sheriff's department, a new one was just beginning. The question was no longer where she was. The question was why. The confirmation of Zila Lowry's identity was a heavy, final period at the end of a sentence. It closed the book on hope, and it opened a new, much darker one. For Sheriff Brody and his team, the investigation pivoted with a violent shift. This was no longer a search. It was a hunt. In any true whodunit, the first question is always the same. Who was the last to see them? The second question follows immediately. Who is the spouse or the ex-spouse? Detectives began the grueling work of retracing a timeline that was already 7 months cold. They returned to the truck stop. They sat down again with Zila's friends, her co-workers, her family. This time, the questions were different. They were not, "Where do you think she went?" They were, "Who was she with? Who did she talk about? Who was in her life?" The word secret came up. Zila was open and bright, but she kept parts of her life to herself. Her relationships were her own. A waitress who had worked the same double shift with Zila provided the first solid thread. She remembered the night clearly. Zila was tired but wired, looking forward to being off. She had been waiting by the door, her coat on. The waitress had asked her if she needed a ride. Zila had smiled, that magnetic smile of hers, and said no. "She told me she was meeting her ex-man," the waitress recalled, her hands fidgeting with a coffee cup. "I asked her if that was a good idea. She just laughed and said he was ancient history, but they had things to talk about." "Her ex-man," the detective repeated. "Did she use a name?" "No, just my ex-man." But everyone in McDowell County knew who that was. The investigation, which had been a wide, shallow pool of speculation, suddenly focused to a single, deep point: Johnny. Johnny was Zila's ex-husband. Theirs had not been a simple, amicable parting. It had been a volatile storm. People who knew them both described it as a fire that was always either warming them or burning them. They had been intensely drawn to each other, a physical connection that seemed to override all logic, and they fought with that same intensity. It was a relationship of slamming doors and passionate reconciliations. They could not seem to live with each other, and for a long time, they could not stay apart. The final break had come when Johnny was sent to prison. The separation, forced by the state, had done what Zila herself could not. She had filed for divorce while he was incarcerated. By the time he was released, she was a free woman. He was, as detectives always knew, one of the first people they had to look at. Now, he was the only one. They found him living in a small rented room on the other side of the county. The interview was tense from the first moment. Johnny was defensive, radiating an impatience that bordered on aggression. "I already told you people," he said, before the detective could even finish the first question. "I ain't seen her in, I don't know, a long time." When I asked him about Zila's disappearance, the detective would later write in his report, he was like, "No, don't know nothing about it, never heard of it." He was dismissive. He spoke of her in the past tense, not as a missing person, but as a closed chapter. "She's just my ex," he said, with a shrug. "That's all. There are some people in this world that, for whatever reason, and particularly when they are talking to law enforcement, will go out of their way to tell something that isn't the truth. Johnny was one of them. The detectives in the room felt it. It was a cold certainty. He was lying, but proving it was a different matter. This brought them to the single greatest obstacle in the case, the fuzzy timeline. The date Zila disappeared was always a little bit off. She had been reported missing days after she was last seen. Her family and friends were used to her being out of touch. Had she vanished on that Tuesday night after her shift? Or had she met her ex-man and then gone somewhere else for a day or two before she met with foul play? No one could say for sure. This haziness gave Johnny an impenetrable defense. When they pressed him for an alibi, he was just as vague as their timeline. "Where were you that week? The last week of July?" "Working, probably," he'd answered. "I don't know. That was 7 months ago. You tell me what you were doing July of last year." Any alibi he could offer was always going to be a little bit fuzzy, because the detectives couldn't match it up with a given date. They couldn't say, "Where were you on this specific night at this specific hour?" They could only ask about a general period of time. They were talking to him in April of the following year. He was right. Nobody could be expected to remember, with certainty, where they were on a random Tuesday in July. He was certainly the suspect. He was the only suspect. But there was simply no evidence to connect him to the crime. The detectives left that interview with a deep, profound sense of frustration. They had a man who lied as easily as he breathed, a victim who had told a friend she was going to meet him, and a gap of 7 months that had swallowed all the proof. The investigation into Johnny had hit a wall of ambiguity. The timeline was a fog, and his denials, though transparently false, were impossible to penetrate without leverage. The detectives had a person of interest but no path forward. They were stuck. They turned back to the only person who could give them a new direction. Dr. John Butts. His first task had been to answer who. His second, far more difficult task was to answer how. Part of his charge, always, in a death investigation, was trying to determine why that person was deceased. He returned his attention to the bones. He had noted some injuries consistent with scavenging animals, predictable and easily dismissed. But there were other injuries. Injuries that were completely unrelated and could never have been caused by animals. These were confined to the head. The skull was severely fragmented. It was not a single break, but a complex map of fractures. In order to figure out what had happened to it, he had to reconstruct it. He began the painstaking process. It was like assembling a shattered porcelain vase in 3 dimensions. He took the pieces, meticulously cleaning their edges, and began to fasten them, gluing them back together again, one by one. He worked in silence, letting the shape reform under his hands. He had to prepare diagrams to document exactly what was going on. He noted that he did not actually have all of the skull bones. There were some parts, particularly on the right side, where the bones were simply missing, lost to the elements or the water. But even without the full picture, the story the bones told was immediate and brutal. It was just clear. There had been massive blunt trauma. In most forensic cases, context is important. You have to understand what happened at the crime scene to make a correlation with what you are looking at on the body. Dr. Butts had to consider the alternatives. If these remains had been found at the bottom of a cliff, lying on some rocks, and the injuries were caused by falling, it was possible that this was an accident. It was even possible that it was a suicide. But that was not the context. She was found wrapped in a sheet or a towel left by the edge of a lake. When the remains are found in a place where there is no way to explain those injuries, no cliff to fall from, no machinery to be caught in, then the only possible inference is that they were inflicted. Someone did this to her. Her skull, he wrote in his report, was more or less crushed. The type of force required to break a skull in that fashion, to fragment it so completely, was enormous. You could not get that by swatting somebody with something soft. You could not get that by kicking them or punching them. It had to be a heavy object, swung with terrible intent, to fracture a skull. This, he concluded, pretty clearly indicated homicide. But he was able to tell the detectives something more, something that would change the entire focus of their investigation. This was not a clean, detached act. The sheer scale of the damage, the repetition suggested by the overlapping fracture lines, it all pointed to something other than a simple desire to end a life. This was an annihilation. When somebody has been killed by this kind of overwhelming blunt force trauma to the head, it is generally one indication of a disorganized or unplanned murder. This was not a robbery gone wrong. This was not a calculated execution. This was rage. A pure, explosive rage. Something had unfolded that propelled the killer into this state, and they had lashed out, striking again and again, long past the point of necessity. Dr. Butts's conclusion was delivered to the detectives, and it landed with the weight of a new revelation. This was a crime of passion. The realization sent a chill through the investigative team. They were not looking for a stranger. They were not looking for a monster lurking in the shadows. They were looking for someone who knew Zila, someone close to her, someone who had been in her life, who had talked with her, perhaps even cared for her. They were looking for someone whose adoration, whose desire, or whose jealousy could, in one terrible, unplanned moment, curl into a violence so profound it sought to erase her. The words crime of passion fundamentally altered the investigation. They were a lens that brought the fuzzy edges of Zila's life into a sharp, uncomfortable focus. Before, the detectives had been looking for a single, obvious answer: the ex-husband. Now, Dr. Butts's conclusion had thrown open a door they had barely looked behind. They were no longer looking for just one man. They were looking for any man who had been close to Zila, anyone who had felt the heat of her attention or the sting of its withdrawal. The investigation, which had been a straight line to Johnny, now exploded outward. It became, as one detective described it, a spiderweb. They had to reevaluate everything. They went back to Zila's friends, to her co-workers, to her family. The questions this time were no longer about her last known movements. They were about her most private life. They were delicate, invasive questions that made people uncomfortable. Who was she seeing? Was she involved with anyone, even casually? Was there anyone who wanted to be more than a friend? Did she ever mention someone who was becoming too intense? The answers painted a portrait of a woman who was, in every sense, a free spirit. Zila, at 24, was fully aware of the effect she had on people, and she enjoyed it. She was magnetic, a spark that drew people in. Her friends described her as someone who loved to be desired, who thrived on the attention. She was, as one friend put it, a little reckless with hearts. Her job at the truck stop was not just a job. It was her stage. It was a place populated by men, some just passing through for a night, others local regulars who came in as much to see her as to eat. She knew how to handle them, how to charm them, how to make each one feel, for a few minutes, like he was the only one in the room. This realization was, for the detectives, a chilling one. That kind of charisma, that kind of power, bred admirers. And admiration, they knew, could easily curdle into something else. Obsession, jealousy, possession. The spiderweb began to grow. Each new interview added another thread. One co-worker mentioned a regular customer, a trucker who always sat in Zila's section. He seemed to believe they had a special connection, that her friendliness was something more. He had, the co-worker said, given Zila small gifts. He hadn't been seen since around the time she disappeared. Another friend recalled an argument Zila had been in, just days before she vanished. She had been upset about a friend who was too much, who was crowding her, but she had brushed it off, refusing to give a name. Then there were the darker whispers, the rumors that Zila had been involved with a man who was not free to be with her. A married man, someone with a family and a reputation in the county, who had become infatuated with her. Such an arrangement was a perfect seed for a crime of passion, a secret that, if threatened with exposure, could lead to a desperate, violent act. It was like a spiderweb, just as the detective had said. They would pull on one thread, and it would shake 3 others. They would track down one viable suspect, only to have him lead them to another, and another. The man who gave her gifts? His trucking logs showed he was in a different state that entire week. The argument with a friend? They finally identified the person, and it was another woman, a dispute over a borrowed item. The rumors of a married man? They were just that, rumors. Whispers in a small town, impossible to substantiate, with no name ever attached. The frustration within the team was palpable. These dead ends were more maddening than the single dead end they had faced with Johnny. At least he was a solid object, a man they could see and question. These new leads were like smoke. Every time they tried to grasp one, it dissipated. They felt lost in the complexities of Zila's private life. She had kept her secrets well. The very nature of these passionate, perhaps illicit connections was that they were kept in the shadows. And now, 7 months later, the shadows were all that remained. The killer was one of those shadows, but he had a name and a face, and he was still out there. The investigation was drowning. The web of Zila's admirers had become a tangle that snared the detectives, leading them in endless, frustrating circles. Weeks of work had turned up nothing. The shadows of her life remained just that, shadows. The trail, which had once felt hot with the revelation of a crime of passion, had grown cold. They were back to where they started, with a single brutal fact. A woman was dead, and they had no idea who had killed her. They did what all investigators do when they hit a wall. They went back to the beginning. They started re-interviewing everyone. This time, they were not just looking for leads. They were looking for anomalies, for tiny details that had been missed, for anything that didn't fit the portrait of the free spirit. It was during a second, weary conversation with Zila's sister that the anomaly finally surfaced. The detective was asking, again, about Zila's state of mind in her final weeks. "We've been focusing on her romantic life," the detective said, "on the men she knew. Was there anyone else she was afraid of? Anyone she had conflict with? Not a boyfriend, but just anyone." Zila's sister hesitated. She was worried, she said slowly. But not about that. Not about some man she was dating. It was family. The detective sat up. This was new. Family? Who? It wasn't about her. It was about Jeremiah. The name hung in the air, unfamiliar to the investigators. Jeremiah Pittman. "My son," Zila's sister said, her voice dropping. "Zila's nephew. He's missing too." It was a stunning development, a jolt to the entire team. They had been so focused on Zila that this second disappearance had been overlooked, treated as a separate, unrelated event. "When did he go missing?" the detective asked, his pen moving quickly. "Weeks before Zila, maybe months. It's hard to say. He was like Zila, a free spirit. We thought he'd just gone." But Zila hadn't believed that. As her sister talked, a new portrait of Zila began to emerge. In the weeks before her own disappearance, she had not been the carefree, partying girl everyone described. She had been a woman obsessed. Jeremiah, at 22, was extremely close to his aunt Zila. They were so close in age, they had basically grown up together. They were more like siblings, partners in crime. They told each other everything. And when Jeremiah vanished, Zila had been devastated. She had been the only one who didn't believe he had just taken off. She had started making efforts to locate him. She had been asking questions, hard questions, dangerous questions. She was stirring things up, her sister said, her eyes welling with a new, dawning horror. She was making calls. She was confronting people. Confronting who? The sister's gaze dropped. She had some pretty strong thoughts about who was involved in his disappearance. The detective waited. The silence in the room was heavy. "She thought his father did it," the sister whispered. "She thought Eddie did something to him. Eddie Pittman, Zila's ex-brother-in-law, Jeremiah's father." Suddenly, the entire case shifted. This was not a spiderweb of jealous admirers. This was something darker, something rooted deep within the family itself. The detectives realized, with a chilling certainty, that Zila's murder might not have been a crime of passion in the way they'd assumed. It might have been an execution, a silencing. 2 young people, both from the same family, both described as free spirits, had vanished. The first had disappeared. The second, who had been trying to find him, was now dead, her body found wrapped in a sheet. The investigation was no longer drowning. It had just found solid, terrifying ground. They had a new name, a new motive, and a connection that was far more sinister than any jilted lover. The name Eddie Pittman landed in the center of the investigation like a stone dropped into a still pond. The ripples spread outward, touching everything, rearranging the entire pattern of the case. The spiderweb of admirers, which had consumed so many weeks, was not just abandoned, it was rendered obsolete. The detectives felt a collective, grim certainty that they had been chasing ghosts while the real, tangible threat had been lurking in the one place they hadn't looked, the family. The investigation, which had been stalled, now moved with a swift, focused energy. The first priority was to build a profile of Eddie Pittman. Who was this man? Zila's ex-brother-in-law, the father of the missing Jeremiah. They began to ask questions, not just of the family, but of people in the county who knew him. A picture formed quickly, and it was not a pleasant one. Eddie was not known as a grieving father. He was known for his temper. He was, in the local parlance, a man with a short fuse. He was described as quiet, until he wasn't. He was a man who held grudges, who saw slights where none were intended, and who responded to conflict not with words, but with a brooding intensity that often tipped into physical intimidation. This information was electric. It resonated perfectly with the profile Dr. Butts had provided from the bones. The medical examiner had described a murder born of explosive, personal rage. The team had mistakenly assumed that passion meant romance. They now saw that passion could also mean fury. Eddie Pittman, the man with the short fuse, was a perfect match for the kind of man who would swing a heavy object with enough force to crush a skull. But the profile was only half of the puzzle. The other half was motive. Why? Why would a man harm his own son? Zila's sister had given them the starting point. Zila believed it, and she was looking for Jeremiah. The detectives dug deeper into that. They went back to the sister, to cousins, to anyone who would talk about the family dynamic. They needed to understand the bad blood that Zila's sister had mentioned. It was a reluctant conversation. Families, especially in this small, insular county, kept their secrets. But the detectives were persistent, and this was now a double investigation. 2 young people were gone. The story that emerged was one of simmering resentment and, finally, a betrayal. There had been some family land, a deed, and signatures. The detectives uncovered rumors that Jeremiah, just before he disappeared, had discovered something. He had found proof that his father, Eddie, had forged signatures on a legal document, effectively cheating other family members out of their share. Jeremiah, at 22, was described as being just like his aunt Zila, free-spirited, but also fiercely loyal and with a rigid sense of right and wrong. He would not have stayed quiet. The detectives could practically hear the confrontation. Jeremiah, young, idealistic, and furious, confronting his father. And Eddie, a man defined by his short fuse, being cornered by his own son, his crime exposed. It was a scenario that led directly to violence. It was a motive for silencing his son. With this, the second piece of the puzzle clicked into place, and it formed a horrifying, unified theory for both disappearances. First, Jeremiah discovers the forgery. He confronts Eddie. Eddie, in a fit of rage at being exposed, silences his son and disposes of his body, believing he has buried his secret with him. He tells everyone that Jeremiah, that free spirit, has just taken off again, just like he always does. The family, perhaps wanting to believe it, accepts this, all except one, Zila. Zila, who knew Jeremiah better than anyone. Zila, who knew he would never just leave without a word to her. She doesn't believe the story for a second. And she too knows about Eddie's temper. She suspects him from day one. So she starts her own investigation. She starts asking questions about the forged deed. She starts confronting family members. She starts making it known that she is looking for Jeremiah, and that she believes Eddie is responsible. She, in her own way, was just as much of a threat to Eddie as Jeremiah had been. She was a loose end, a voice that would not be silenced. Eddie, the detectives reasoned, saw Zila's persistence not as grief, but as a direct threat. She was getting too close. She was stirring up the very secret he had already killed to protect. So he had to silence her, too. The theory was clean. It was terrifying. It linked both victims. It provided a powerful motive. and it matched the violent, rage-driven physical evidence that Dr. Butts had meticulously reconstructed from the shattered fragments of Zila's skull. The detectives no longer had a list of suspects. They had one: Eddie Pittman. The theory was perfect. It was a single, clean line that connected every disparate fact. It explained Jeremiah's disappearance, Zila's obsessive search, and the violent, rage-filled nature of her death. But a theory, no matter how perfect, is not evidence. It is a story, and in a court of law, it is nothing. The detectives had their story, but they had no proof. They had no physical link between Eddie Pittman and Zila Lowry. And for Jeremiah, they didn't even have a body. The investigation, which had surged with new energy, now hit a wall of procedure. To move forward, they needed to crack the wall that Eddie Pittman had built around his family. They needed to get inside his home, not just physically, but psychologically. And that meant talking to the two people at its center, Eddie and his wife, Rosemary. A team of detectives, including the lead investigator, Dudley Green, made the visit. Green was a quiet, patient man, a career cop who understood the nuances of a small county, who knew that more could be learned from what wasn't said. The Pittman house was cold, not from the weather, but from the silence within. Eddie met them at the door. He was exactly as he had been described. He was not a large man, but he carried an atmosphere of coiled tension. His denial was immediate and hostile. He sat across from them, his arms crossed, his eyes flat and angry. "We've been over this," he spat. "My son's gone. He took off. That's what he does. And Zila was wild. No telling who she got tangled up with. It's got nothing to do with me." He showed no grief, no sadness. Not for his son, not for his ex-sister-in-law. There was only a simmering annoyance that these men were in his house, breathing his air, asking his questions. But while Eddie's anger was a performance, a show of force, Rosemary was something else entirely. She sat beside her husband, but she seemed to be 1,000 miles away. She was a ghost in her own living room. She was pale, thin, and her hands were clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. When Green directed a question to her, she flinched, as if the sound of her own name was a blow. "Rosemary, when did you last see Jeremiah?" Green asked, his voice gentle. She looked first at Eddie, a brief, terrified flicker of her eyes. Eddie's face was unmoving. He just left," she said. Her voice was a monotone, a rehearsed line. Like Eddie said, he just left. "And Zila?" Green pressed, watching her. She'd been coming around, asking questions about Jeremiah. Rosemary's hands tightened. I don't remember. Zila was always around. She was wild. It was an echo. She was just parroting her husband's words. Green could feel the suffocating weight of fear in the room. It was rolling off her in waves, so thick it was almost a physical presence. Eddie's anger was a shield. Rosemary's silence was a prison. The detectives left with nothing. The united front was perfect. Eddie was hostile, and Rosemary was a stone. They were back to square one. But Dudley Green could not shake the feeling. "She's not cold," he told his team back at the office. "She's terrified. He has her so locked down, she's afraid to breathe. She knows something. She knows everything." They had no legal grounds to push further. They couldn't get a warrant based on a perfect theory and a wife's terrified silence. They were stuck. All they could do was wait. They continued to interview distant family members, neighbors, anyone who might have seen something, anything, that could give them leverage. They were waiting for a crack. Days passed. The pressure of being the focus of a murder investigation, of having police cars drive past your house, of being the subject of whispers in the county, began to mount. Then, one afternoon, the crack appeared. A figure walked into the sheriff's office. The officer at the desk looked up and barely recognized her. It was Rosemary Pittman, but she looked even smaller, more fragile than she had in her own home. She was trembling, her eyes wide, darting to the door as if she expected to be followed. I need to see someone," she stammered. "Who do you need to see, ma'am?" She swallowed, her hands twisting the strap of her purse. The detective. The one who was at my house. The quiet one. Green. I need to see Detective Green. Green was summoned immediately. He took one look at her and knew this was it. He led her to a small, private interview room, away from the main floor. She sat on the edge of the chair, unable to be still, rocking almost imperceptibly. "Thank you for coming in, Rosemary," Green said, keeping his voice calm and low. "What's on your mind?" She just shook her head, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I can't. I shouldn't be here. He'll know." "Who will know, Rosemary? Eddie?" She flinched at his name. "He'll, I think. I think he's going to kill me." The words dropped into the quiet of the room. This was the moment. Green leaned forward, his voice steady. "Why, Rosemary? Why would you think he would want to kill you?" She finally stopped rocking. She looked up, and for the first time, Green saw something other than fear in her eyes. He saw the horror that had been living behind them. "Because," she whispered, her voice breaking, "because of what I could tell you, because of what I won't, what I can't keep quiet about anymore." "What is that, Rosemary? What did you see?" Her composure shattered. A sob tore from her. "His son, Jeremiah. I know what he did. I know, because I saw it." Rosemary's confession spilled out in a torrent of fear and fractured memories, each word landing like a physical blow in the quiet office. She spoke of a confrontation, of a rage that had boiled over, and of an act so final she had buried the sight of it deep within her mind. She described what she had seen, her voice barely a whisper, and the investigators listened, the air growing thick with the horror of her account. It was not a suspicion. It was an eyewitness testament. She agreed to show them. The procession was grim, a quiet convoy driven by a wife's terrible knowledge. There was no hesitation in her direction, no uncertainty. She guided them with a chilling pinpoint accuracy, as if the memory, once unlocked, was now playing before her eyes with perfect clarity. She finally instructed them to stop. Her hand, trembling, pointed not to a landmark or a feature, but to a patch of ground that looked like any other. "There," she said, her voice hollow. It took time. The work was methodical, agonizing, but she was right. What they unearthed confirmed her story completely. They had found Jeremiah. The call went to the medical examiner's office. The findings were swift and sickeningly familiar. The cause of death was identical to the manner of Zila's passing: massive, catastrophic blunt force trauma to the head. The parallel was absolute, a terrifying signature. The investigators now understood the rage Dr. Butts had spoken of. They had found its source, and they had found its other victim. The arrest was immediate. When the detectives confronted Eddie Pittman, there was no preamble, no gentle questioning. They charged him with the murder of his own son. Eddie's composure was unnerving. He stood stone-faced as the gravity of the accusation settled, his expression unreadable. He looked from one detective to the other, his gaze cold. Then he spoke his only words, a question that would haunt everyone present. "Whose?" The county erupted. To the community, the case was closed. Eddie Pittman was a monster, a man capable of killing his own son and then killing his ex-brother-in-law's sister when she discovered the truth. He fit the profile perfectly. He was the embodiment of the passion-fueled violence that had taken Zila. The detectives felt it too. They were certain he was their man for both. But certainty was not evidence. As they built their case for the murder of Jeremiah Pittman, a stark and frustrating reality set in. They had nothing, not one single thread, to tie Eddie Pittman to the death of Zila Lowry. 11 years. A full decade, and then one more. Time moved differently for the detectives who had first handled the case. It was a weight, a heavy coat they could never take off. For the newer officers, the name Zila Lowry was a story told on long, quiet shifts, a piece of departmental lore. The case file itself, thick and worn, had been transferred from one cabinet to another, its pages yellowing, the ink on the original reports beginning to fade. It was a ghost, a silent resident of the sheriff's office. It represented a cold, hard stop, a question that had festered for so long it had become part of the building's foundation. Eddie Pittman was serving his time for the murder of his son, but the shadow of Zila's death still stretched long and unanswered. Then, a new word began to circulate, filtering in from state bulletins and forensic journals. Deoxyribonucleic acid. It was a whisper at first, a complex theory, then a fledgling practice. They called it genetic fingerprinting. It was a science that promised the impossible, to pull an identity from the smallest, most degraded traces of a person. It was a sliver of hope, so thin it was almost cruel. But after 11 years of nothing, it was the only thing they had. The conversation that followed was one of the most difficult of Detective Green's career. He sat with Zila's family, the passage of time etched into their faces. He had to ask them for permission to revisit their deepest trauma, to physically disturb her rest. The word exhume hung in the air, a terrible, heavy thing. He explained the science, the possibility, the long odds. He watched them relive every moment of their loss, the old wound torn open as if it had never begun to heal. After a long silence, they gave their consent, not with a surge of new hope, but with a profound, weary resignation. Dr. Butts, now grayer and more methodical than ever, oversaw the procedure. His focus was absolute. From the remains, he carefully, meticulously collected 4 of her molar teeth. These, he explained, were the body's time capsules, the dense enamel protecting the vital pulp within, offering the best chance to find what he was looking for. The teeth were sent to a specialized lab. The wait was agonizing, stretching from weeks into months. Finally, a report returned. It was not a name, not an answer, but it was, in its own way, a resurrection. The lab had succeeded. They had painstakingly built a profile, a unique, complex sequence of markers. A standard was created. They finally had Zila's genetic fingerprint, a code of silent data, waiting in a database for a ghost to match. The DNA standard existed, a perfect, sterile map of Zila's identity, locked away in a laboratory file, but it was a key without a corresponding lock. It needed a comparison, a sample from a suspect, and the investigation had produced no one. The file remained open, gathering dust, a monument to a long failure. The detectives who had worked it initially were nearing retirement, the case a permanent, heavy mark on their careers. The passage of time had stretched well beyond a decade. And then, the call came. It originated from deep within the walls of a state correctional facility, a place where information was its own, desperate currency. An inmate, a man named Ronald McMahon, was claiming to have something. He was a career criminal, a man whose entire life was a series of calculations for personal advantage. He was, by every definition, an unreliable source. He was looking for a deal, offering a whisper from the past in exchange for a reduction in his future. The detectives met his claims with heavy, practiced skepticism. His story was flimsy, bordering on useless. He spoke of a time long ago, back around the time Zila Lowry had vanished. He mentioned 2 men. He did not know their last names. He did not know where they were from. He knew them only as Robin and Bobby. He said they had been living in a mobile home, one of an unknown number that had once dotted the county. They were strangers, not local boys, and he remembered them only because they had partied hard and then disappeared as quickly as they had arrived. It was almost nothing, 2 common first names, an abandoned dwelling somewhere. This was not evidence. It was a ghost story from a man who benefited directly from telling it. After so many years of sophisticated forensic strategies and agonizing procedural dead ends, this was what they were left with. It was the thinnest, most fragile thread imaginable. But in a case that had been cold for so very long, it was the only thread they had. The lead was almost nothing. Robin and Bobby. 2 first names, offered by a desperate inmate in exchange for favor, floating in an ocean of time that now spanned well over a decade. For the investigators, it was a frustrating, almost insulting, place to begin again. It meant abandoning modern techniques and returning to the slow, agonizing work of digging through physical archives. They spent weeks immersed in the smell of dust and decaying paper, pulling old, forgotten utility manifests, property rental agreements, and county tax ledgers from a time just before the world had digitized. They were looking for any document that might connect these two phantom names to a physical location. After weeks of exhausting, manual searches, they found it. A single, brittle power company receipt for a mobile home, dated from the correct period. The name on the line was Robin Whitehead. It was the first solid piece of the thread. They began to trace it, following the faint paper trail of one man's life as it moved forward, from this county to another, then across 2 state lines. The man they eventually located, Robin Whitehead, was a world away from the person they had imagined. He was a devout family man, his life apparently rebuilt on a foundation of stability and faith. The arrival of detectives on his doorstep seemed to shatter his carefully constructed peace. A visible, uncontrollable tremor started in his hands. He looked at them with a kind of hollow terror, as if they were ghosts from a life he had tried to bury. His denial was immediate but weak, collapsing under the weight of their quiet, persistent questions. He was nervous, evasive, his eyes darting away. But the pressure of their presence was too much. He finally admitted it. Yes, he had known Zila Lowry. His voice was a strained whisper. He claimed she had been to his old trailer, but only once, he insisted, just to party. He tried to minimize the connection, to shrink it into a single, insignificant evening. But when they asked for his roommate's name, he broke. He named him Bobby Taylor. The jailhouse tip, once so flimsy, was now chillingly concrete. Armed with the address from the utility record, the investigators located the trailer. It was a scene of absolute desolation. It was not just abandoned, it was a collapsed wreck, a skeletal ruin that had been left open to the elements for 14 years. Its windows were gone, its door long since rotted from its hinges. It seemed utterly hopeless. Time, rain, and animals had surely destroyed anything that might have been left. It felt like a final, definitive dead end. A forensic specialist joined them, surveying the decayed interior with a grim expression. It was, by any normal standard, a lost cause, but he had one last, desperate option. They waited until the sun had set completely, until the area was plunged into absolute darkness. The specialist entered the ruined structure, his movements careful on the rotting floor. He began to spray a chemical called Blue Star, its fine mist settling over the decayed surfaces of what had once been a bedroom. After several agonizing minutes of silence, he switched on his light. In the impenetrable blackness, the room exploded. It was not a small patch. It was a vast, blinding, star-like pattern that covered the floor and the lower portions of the walls. The chemical had found its target. It illuminated the silent, terrible ghost of a massive bloodstain, one that someone had tried, desperately and violently, to scrub away. The room lit up, revealing the silent, star-like patterns of old, cleaned-up blood. The samples were collected with a grim, almost funereal reverence. What the Blue Star had revealed was now scraped, swabbed, and cut from the rotting floorboards, a harvest of microscopic fragments preserved in sterile containers. The evidence was, by any scientific measure, a catastrophe. It was 14 years old, subjected to a decade and a half of blistering summers, freezing winters, and soaking rain. It was not just old, it was elemental, a biological ruin. The detectives who submitted it to the lab did so with a professional duty that masked a deep, shared pessimism. They had been given a miracle, the discovery of the blood, only to have it present an almost certain impossibility, the extraction of an identity. The wait for the analysis stretched into weeks, a period of profound anxiety for the investigation team. Every passing day felt like a victory for the passage of time, a further decay of their only lead. The process in the lab was not a simple test. It was an agonizing, painstaking attempt at reconstruction. Scientists were trying to amplify whisper-thin fragments of deoxyribonucleic acid to find enough intact markers to build even a partial profile. The initial feedback was not promising. The material was, as one technician termed it, incredibly compromised. Finally, the first official report was delivered. It landed on the detective's desk with a heavy, final thud. The conclusion was exactly what they had dreaded. The DNA was too degraded for a conclusive match. The report stated, in clear, unambiguous language, that a one-to-one identification was statistically impossible. The fragments were too broken, the sequence too incomplete. It was a devastating, heartbreaking blow. It felt as though the case had definitively closed, the science itself agreeing that the past was too far gone to be recovered. The elation they had felt in that dark, glowing trailer evaporated, replaced by the familiar, cold weight of failure. The file was set aside, but the lead detective, unable to let it go, found himself rereading the technical data late one night, scanning past the damning conclusion at the top. He was looking for anything, a word, a number, that defied the summary, and he found it. Buried deep in the technical analysis was a standard line of forensic language. The sample does not exclude Zila Lowry. This was a common, cautious phrase, meaning she could not be ruled out as the source, but it was far from proof. He kept reading. Then, in a separate section detailing the specific genetic loci the lab was able to isolate, there was a note. The analyst had flagged an anomaly. The degraded DNA from the trailer floor contained a rare extra allele, a genetic stutter, a small, unusual quirk in the sequence. It was a finding of note, a tiny, strange flag in the ravaged data. A new, frantic energy seized the detective. He called the lab chief at home. He did not ask for a new analysis, he asked for a simple comparison. They had Zila's pristine DNA profile, the one built from her molar teeth, sitting in their database. He needed them to check that standard against this one specific anomaly. Did her DNA have this same rare quirk? The wait this time was only a day, but it was the longest of their lives. The call came. The answer was yes. The genetic standard taken from Zila's teeth, the map of her identity, possessed the exact same, extraordinarily rare allele. The implications of this fact settled over the team with overwhelming force. This was no longer a question of a degraded, inconclusive sample. This was a statistical lock. The chances of two unrelated individuals possessing this specific genetic anomaly were not 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000. The lab began running the numbers, the probability shrinking to 1 in millions. It was the genetic equivalent of finding a signature. The blood in the trailer and the DNA from Zila's remains were, beyond any reasonable doubt, from the same person. The wall of 14 years had just crumbled. They had found her. This was the place. This was where Zila's life had ended. The detectives did not call Robin Whitehead. They did not request an interview. They simply appeared, their arrival a quiet, undeniable judgment on his doorstep. This time, they did not wait in their car or offer polite greetings. The man who answered the door was the same devout family man, but the fear he had shown before was now a suffocating, paralyzing dread. He seemed to know, instinctively, that this was not a follow-up. It was an end. They sat him down in his own living room, the atmosphere thick with the unsaid. The lead detective leaned forward, his voice low, devoid of accusation, freighted only with absolute certainty. He did not ask questions. He told a story. He spoke of a dilapidated mobile home, left to rot for over a decade. He described the utter darkness inside and the chemical mist that had settled on the decayed floor. He spoke of the patterns that had bloomed in the blackness, a constellation of old, scrubbed blood. Robin's composure dissolved. A choked sound escaped him, his face ashen. The detective continued, his voice relentless. He explained how the blood was sent to the lab, how it was degraded almost beyond recovery. He paused, letting the silence stretch, before he delivered the final, inescapable truth. He told Robin about the DNA standard, the one built from Zila's teeth, and then he told him about the anomaly. He explained what a rare allele was. He described it as a genetic signature, a quirk so unusual that finding it in two separate places was a statistical impossibility. He told Robin, his gaze unwavering, that Zila's pristine DNA contained this exact rare marker, and so did the blood on the trailer floor. "It was her, Robin," the detective said, his voice flat. "We know. The science is absolute. We know she was there. We know she died there." It was as if a structural support deep inside Robin Whitehead had snapped. The burden of 14 years, the weight of a secret carried through a marriage, through the birth of his children, through every prayer he had ever uttered, came crashing down. He began to sob, not a quiet cry, but a deep, agonizing, full-bodied collapse. The man who had built a new life on a foundation of faith was finally broken by a truth he had tried to bury. His confession, when it came, was a torrent. It was disjointed at first, a flood of fractured memories and panicked justifications. But the detectives let him speak, guiding him gently back to the timeline. He and Bobby Taylor, they were partying with Zila. She was magnetic, just as everyone had said. He admitted, his voice thick with shame, that Zila had been more interested in him, Robin. She had chosen him. He recounted how the two of them had become intimate, moving into the bedroom, leaving Bobby Taylor alone in the other room. The party, for Bobby, was over. He had been the one to invite Zila, to set the night in motion, and he had become an invisible spectator. Robin, trying to explain, his words tumbling out, said, He took it very personally. The rage was instant. Robin described Bobby Taylor bursting into the room, his face a mask of jealousy so profound it was inhuman. He had grabbed a heavy object, something from the room. Robin couldn't even remember what, only that it was heavy. The attack was immediate, ferocious, and focused entirely on Zila. It was exactly the overwhelming, personal violence Dr. Butts had seen on the reconstructed skull. Robin's terror was absolute. He was paralyzed, watching the unthinkable happen. When it was over, Bobby, in that same cold rage, had turned to him. There was no discussion. It was coercion, a silent, terrifying understanding that Robin would either be an accomplice or the next victim. He confessed to it all, helping to wrap her body in the sheet, the numb, silent drive in the darkness, and the grim, desperate act of leaving her by the water's edge at Lake James. After 14 years, the puzzle was finally, agonizingly, complete. The ghost of the case was laid to rest. There was no intricate conspiracy, no bad blood over land, no deep family feud. It was a story as old and as tragic as any. It was the story of a final, fatal rejection.